The conference room felt smaller than usual as I sat across from my brother-in-law Robert at his so-called emergency family meeting. My wife Claire squeezed my hand under the table while Robert shuffled through papers with that self-important look he always wore. He'd called this meeting to discuss what he called my financial irresponsibility, which was rich coming from someone who drove a leased Mercedes he couldn't actually afford. Robert cleared his throat and announced that as the family's most successful member, he felt obligated to address some concerns. He said he'd noticed I was still working as a high school teacher at 38 years old, and he was worried about my future. His wife Patricia nodded along like one of those dashboard bobbleheads. Their daughter Madison sat in the corner, scrolling through her phone, barely paying attention to her father's performance. I asked what exactly concerned him about my career. Robert leaned back in his chair and explained that teaching was noble, of course, but let's be realistic, the pay was modest at best, there was no real growth potential, and he worried about how Claire and I would manage retirement or emergencies. He said this with the confidence of someone who believed he was offering profound wisdom rather than thinly veiled condescension. Claire started to speak, but Robert held up his hand, saying he wasn't finished. He continued that he'd actually spoken to a friend at his investment firm who might be able to get me an entry-level position, nothing glamorous, but at least it would be a step toward a real career with real earning potential. Patricia added that it was never too late to make a change, that plenty of people switch careers in their late 30s. I sat there quietly while Robert laid out his vision for fixing my inadequate life. He suggested I could tutor on weekends to save up for proper business attire, that I need to be willing to start at the bottom and work my way up, that the first few years would be tough, but eventually I might make what he called a livable wage. The condescension dripped from every word as he painted a picture of himself as my generous benefactor offering to rescue me from my mediocre existence. But what Robert didn't know would make him wish he'd kept his mouth shut. Claire finally spoke up, saying that I loved teaching and was excellent at it. Robert smiled that patronizing smile and said, of course, emotional fulfillment was important, but so was being able to provide properly for one's family. He looked directly at Claire and said he worried about her future being married to someone with such limited financial prospects. Patricia nodded vigorously, adding that it was different for them. Robert earned enough that she could focus on volunteering and maintaining their social standing. I asked Robert how much he thought I made as a teacher. He laughed and said probably 40, maybe 50,000 if I was lucky. Patricia gasped like 50,000 was barely enough to survive on. Their daughter Madison looked up from her phone for the first time. Apparently, even she found this interesting. Robert continued that he knew teachers were underpaid. It was a national tragedy, really, but that was exactly his point about why I needed a career change. I pulled out my phone and opened my banking app. I turned the screen toward Robert and asked him to read the balance. His face went pale as he stared at the number. $743,000 in my checking account alone. Patricia leaned over to look, and her mouth fell open. Claire squeezed my hand harder. She knew it was coming. Robert stammered, asking how. Where did? That couldn't be right. I explained calmly that yes, I made $52,000 as a teacher, but what I'd never mentioned to the family was that I'd written a series of educational software programs over the past decade. They'd started as tools for my classroom, but I'd eventually licensed them to school districts across the country. The passive income was substantial, around $30,000 per month, and had been for the past 6 years. I told him that was just the checking account, the amount I kept liquid for expenses. I opened another app showing my investment portfolio, $1.4 million in stocks and bonds. Another app showed my retirement accounts, $800,000. I'd maxed out contributions every year since I was 25. The silence in the room was deafening as Robert processed that his poor, struggling teacher brother-in-law had more money than he'd see in a lifetime. But the real shock came when I revealed what else I'd been doing with my modest teacher salary. I looked at Robert and asked if he remembered 5 years ago when his startup company nearly went bankrupt and he desperately needed $50,000 to make payroll. He nodded slowly, his face now bright red. I asked if he remembered who'd loaned him that money without hesitation. He whispered that it was from his investor friend Marcus. I smiled and said, "No, Robert. Marcus was me. I'd created that persona, because I knew he'd never accept money from his loser teacher brother-in-law. Patricia's face was white as I continued. I asked if she remembered 3 years ago when their daughter Madison needed emergency surgery and their insurance denied the claim. The mystery benefactor who paid the $75,000 hospital bill directly. Patricia looked like she might be sick as she realized that was me too. I'd set up an anonymous payment system specifically so they wouldn't know it was coming from the person they'd spent years condescending to. Robert tried to speak, but I wasn't finished. I mentioned the down payment on their house, the one they thought came from Patricia's inheritance. That was $30,000 from me. The money from Madison's private school tuition when Robert's company had another rough year. $15,000 annually for 3 years. The loan for their kitchen renovation that they thought came from a bank. $40,000 from me, with forged loan documents to make it look official. I pulled out a folder I brought and slid it across the table. Inside were copies of every transaction, every transfer, every time I'd quietly bailed them out while they'd simultaneously looked down on my career choice. The total came to $360,000 over 8 years. I kept meticulous records, not because I wanted repayment, but because I needed to remember the cost of trying to help someone who saw me as beneath them. Claire spoke up for the first time, saying that what hurt wasn't the money. It was sitting through years of family dinners where Robert would make jokes about my teacher's salary, where Patricia would sigh sympathetically about how hard it must be for us to make ends meet, where they'd offer unsolicited financial advice to someone who'd been subsidizing their entire lifestyle. Robert finally found his voice, asking why I never said anything, why I let them think I was struggling. I replied that initially I thought being humble about money was the right approach, that maybe Robert's struggles with his business made him feel better being the successful one in the family. But after tonight's intervention, after being told I needed to tutor on weekends to afford a real career, I realized I'd been enabling his delusion at the cost of my own dignity. Patricia asked in a small voice if I wanted the money back. I said no, I'd given it freely and never expected repayment. But I was done being their safety net while also being their punchline. The anonymous investor Marcus was officially retiring. The mystery benefactor had made his final contribution. From now on, they'd have to manage their finances based on what they actually earned rather than what secretly flowed in from the person they'd spent years pitying. Madison, who'd been silent this whole time, spoke up, asking if this meant she'd have to leave Westbrook Academy. I looked at her and said that was a conversation her parents needed to have based on what they could actually afford, not what they'd become accustomed to spending. She nodded, and for the first time I saw something like respect in her eyes, rather than the bored dismissal she usually showed her poor teacher uncle. Robert asked what he was supposed to tell people, his investors, his clients, people who thought he was successful. I replied that maybe he should tell them the truth, or better yet, actually become as successful as he pretended to be. Patricia added quietly that this would humiliate them socially. Claire responded that it was humiliating spending 8 years listening to them pity us at every family gathering while we paid their bills behind the scenes. The meeting ended shortly after that. Robert and Patricia left without another word, Madison trailing behind them, looking at her parents differently than she had an hour before. Claire and I sat in the empty conference room for a while afterward. She asked if I felt bad about cutting them off. I said I felt bad it took me this long to value my own dignity over their comfort. That evening, my mother called, asking what happened at the meeting. Apparently, Robert had called her in tears, saying I'd humiliated him by flaunting my wealth. I asked if Robert mentioned the part where he'd spent an hour telling me I needed to get a real job. My mother sighed and said Robert was embarrassed. That pride was a fragile thing. I replied that so was being treated with basic respect, and I'd gone without that for 8 years while protecting his pride. She said I was being cruel by cutting off the financial support. I asked if it was cruel when Robert held an intervention to tell me my career was inadequate. She went quiet. I continued that for 8 years, I'd quietly helped them through every crisis while they publicly treated me like a charity case. That the cruelty was already happening, I was just no longer funding it. But what happened over the next few months showed me I'd made the right decision. The first month was quiet. No calls, no texts, just silence from Robert's family. Then Claire's birthday came around, And for the first time in a decade, Robert's family didn't attend. Claire said she wasn't surprised, but I could see it hurt her. Her brother had chosen his embarrassment over their relationship. The second month, I heard through my mother that Robert had laid off half his staff. His business was struggling again, but this time, there was no mysterious investor to make payroll. Patricia had started working part-time at a boutique, something she'd previously considered beneath her. Madison had transferred to public school, and according to my mother, was actually thriving there, joining the robotics club and making friends who cared about things other than designer labels. The third month, Robert called me. His voice was different, smaller somehow. He said his business was failing and he didn't know what to do. I asked what he wanted from me. He said honestly he didn't know, that he wasn't calling for money because he knew that door was closed. He called because I was the only person who'd ever believed in his business enough to invest in it, even when it was failing, and he wanted to understand why. I told him the truth, that I'd invested because he was family and I wanted him to succeed. That I'd kept it anonymous because I knew his pride wouldn't let him accept help from someone he saw as less successful. That I'd hoped eventually he'd see me as an equal rather than someone to pity. He was quiet for a long time, then said he'd been an idiot. I agreed. He asked if there was any way to fix this, not the money but the relationship. I said that depended on whether he could respect me as I actually was rather than who he'd decided I should be. He asked what I meant. I explained that I didn't need a job at his friend's investment firm. I didn't need tutoring gigs to make ends meet. I didn't need career advice from someone who'd built their success on loans from the person they were advising. What I needed was a brother-in-law who could accept that success looked different for different people. Robert said his business was closing next month, that he'd be looking for regular employment himself. There was no shame in his voice this time, just exhaustion. He said maybe he'd finally understand what it was like to work a normal job without the entrepreneur ego. I told him there was dignity in all honest work, that he might actually find it refreshing not having to pretend anymore. 6 months after the meeting, Robert and Patricia came to our house for dinner. It was the first time we'd seen them since that day. It looked different, lighter somehow. Patricia had given up the designer clothes for normal department store outfits and somehow looked more comfortable. Robert was working as a project manager at a tech company, making decent money, but nothing like what he'd claimed to earn before. Madison was with them, and she actually put her phone away during dinner. She told us about her robotics team making it to state finals, about her new friends, about how she was learning to code, and thought she might want to teach one day. I saw Robert flinch slightly at that last part, but he recovered and said that would be wonderful, that teachers shaped lives in ways most people never realized. After dinner, Robert pulled me aside and said he owed me an apology, a real one. He said the money was one thing, but the disrespect was another. That he'd spent years protecting his ego by diminishing mine, and he was ashamed of who he'd been. I told him I appreciated that. He asked if we could start over, as equals this time. I said we could try. Patricia apologized to Claire privately, saying she'd been so focused on maintaining appearances that she'd forgotten what actually mattered. Claire hugged her and said she'd missed her sister-in-law. Over the next year, they rebuilt their friendship, this time based on truth rather than pretense. Robert's business stayed closed, but he seemed happier working for someone else. The stress of pretending to be more successful than he was had been eating him alive for years. Now he could just do good work and go home. Patricia enjoyed her boutique job and had started managing the store. Madison graduated with honors and got a full scholarship to study computer science. 2 years after the meeting, Robert helped me launch a new educational software project. He didn't invest money, but contributed his project management expertise. We were partners this time, real ones, neither pretending to be more than we were. The software was successful, and I insisted on splitting the profits equally. He tried to refuse, saying he hadn't put in money, but I told him his contribution was just as valuable, that I'd learned through all of this that worth wasn't measured in dollars, but in what you brought to the table. My mother called one evening and said she was proud of how I'd handled everything, that it would have been easy to gloat or punish Robert further, but instead I'd given him the space to change. I told her I'd never wanted to punish him. I just needed him to see me clearly. She said sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone is letting them face the natural consequences of their choices without rescuing them. The last time I saw Robert, he thanked me for the intervention, Said it was the wake-up call he needed, even if he'd hated it at the time. I told him I didn't do it to teach him a lesson. I did it to protect my own peace. But if he learned something from it, that was a bonus. He laughed and said I was still too humble, that I should take credit for changing his entire family's trajectory. Maybe he was right. Sometimes people need to lose their false supports before they can build real strength. Sometimes they need to face their own finances before they can appreciate what others have built. And sometimes the kindest thing you can do for someone isn't continuing to enable their delusions, but stepping back and letting reality teach the lessons you couldn't. Robert learned those lessons the expensive way, $360,000 expensive. But he learned them. And now we have something we never had before: mutual respect, honest communication, and a relationship built on truth rather than my secret safety net. That's worth more than any amount of money I ever gave him.